Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. I would argue that one of our most famous monarchs was Queen Elizabeth I. She presided over a period that is thought of by many as a golden age. She's also famously known as the Virgin Queen. But just why didn't she get married? For us, it's perhaps a foregone conclusion. We know that she doesn't get married, so of course it makes sense to us. But I think for people living at the time, and particularly for her chief counsellors and advisors, her choice is confusing and also alarming. So why is it the choice that she makes? In recent years, there has been a growing trend to attempt to diagnose prominent figures from our past. The process is known as posthumous or retrospective diagnosis, and it's what happens when medical researchers team up with historians to bring their modern medical knowledge to bear on our understanding of past figures. And it can yield fascinating results. They can offer hypotheses about how a person acted, looked, and even died. Of course, it has its limitations. Because most of the people under study are kings, queens, princes, princesses, dukes, duchesses, etc., there is not going to be granted the permission to exhume the bodies. The medical researchers aren't going to have access to the earthly remains to run the tests that they would need to turn hypothesis into proof. However, there is one notable example where this didn't happen, of course, and that is in the case of Richard III. When that king was found in the car park and exhumed, historians and medical researchers could work on his earthly remains. They could find evidence for the injuries he suffered at Bosworth Field. They think they know which one may have been the fatal blow. And also, they believe they found evidence of posthumous desecration of his body. We can almost now visualise how it all played out. Additionally, we all saw in the TV documentary of it just how scoliosed his spine was. We got a great picture of how Richard III may have looked in life from the facial reconstruction. All of this is immensely useful. However, I don't think anybody is going to be granted a similar level of access to the earthly remains of Queen Elizabeth I. But it does not stop us from hypothesising. And so let's look at the ways in which people have sought to diagnose Queen Elizabeth I, in particular in relation to her decision to never marry. There is a psychological hypothesis about Elizabeth's refusal to marry, namely that events in her childhood were so traumatic for her that it gave her what some have called a mortal fear of the state of matrimony. So let's have a look at a timeline of these events and think about whether or not they might have generated just that level of trauma. On the 7th of September 1533, Elizabeth is born at Greenwich Palace to Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Much has been made of the fact that Henry would have been disappointed that Elizabeth was a girl and not the son and heir that he thought he deserved. On the 19th of May 1536, her father has her mother executed on what many believe were trumped-up charges of treason and adultery. Elizabeth had not yet turned 3 years old. Is it possible that at this formative moment, marriage and sex were being connected in Elizabeth's mind with death? On the 24th of October 1537, her stepmother, Jane Seymour, dies from childbirth complications when Elizabeth had just turned 4. On the 13th of May 1542, Elizabeth is 8 years old when her father executes her stepmother and cousin, Catherine Howard, for adultery. On the 28th of January 1547, Henry dies. Elizabeth is 13 years old. Her last stepmother remarries quickly. Her stepmother's new husband is Edward VI's uncle, Thomas Seymour. The marriage is viewed by many, including Elizabeth's siblings, as a scandal. Elizabeth lives with Catherine and Thomas Seymour, and it seems clear that he begins to groom her. He may have sexually abused the teenager. Catherine sends her away in 1548. The Dowager Queen is, at this point, a few months pregnant. On the 5th of September 1548, the Dowager Queen, Catherine Parr, dies from childbirth complications. On the 17th of November 1558, Elizabeth is 25 years old and her elder sister Mary I has died. Elizabeth is now Queen of England. She would have been aware that her sister's short reign had been marred by unrest related to her faith, her foreign marriage, and her, as it was seen at the time, phantom pregnancies. It is perhaps plausible, if not totally understandable, that the young Elizabeth, witnessing the disastrous consequences of marriage firsthand, may have been thoroughly put off from the whole process. However, this psychological diagnosis is not the only one floating around that attempts to explain Elizabeth's reticence to marry. In August 1985, an article was published by R. Bakken. In it, Bakken asserts that Elizabeth had testicular feminisation, which is now known as complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. A child is born and appears female, but rather than having the internal sex organs of a female, instead they have internal testicles. As Elizabeth would have grown, she would have become quite aware that something wasn't right, that she wasn't like the other girls. She would, of course, not have been able to menstruate. She may, therefore, have been very aware that she was infertile, unable to bear an heir. Bakken's reasoning behind this diagnosis is, however, a bit of a stretch for me. The symptoms listed include Elizabeth's unusual height. Well, Mary Queen of Scots was taller. Elizabeth's long fingers, her athletic aptitude, and the fact that she denied the ministrations of doctors close to her death and also refused to allow them to do a post-mortem after it. This is a massive stretch as far as I'm concerned. Because I think if Elizabeth weren't capable of menstruating, it would have been recorded. The notion to me that there weren't women in her household in the employ of the crowned heads of Europe is incredibly unlikely, particularly if those crowned heads were thinking of Elizabeth as a potential bride. If they are going to enter into a marriage with the English Queen, they're going to want an heir. She may be a queen, but her job is also to be a mother of sons and daughters. If she was incapable of doing so, if she were not menstruating, they would have known about it. They would have made it their business to know about it. And therefore, as records become opened, as archives become accessible to more and more people, we would also know about it now. I wonder if Bakken's hypothesis is actually more influenced by a much older conspiracy theory, one given oxygen in Bram Stoker's famous Impostors, namely that at some point in her childhood, Elizabeth died and was replaced by a boy. This conspiracy theory is known as the Bisley Boy story. When Elizabeth was around 10 or 11, she was evacuated from London for fear of plague. She ends up in Bisley, Gloucestershire. While there, she falls ill unexpectedly and quickly passes away. The people looking after Elizabeth would, of course, have been utterly terrified. So they start casting around for a replacement. For some reason, in the village of Bisley, there are no girls of a like age or hair colour or complexion. But there is a red-headed, fair-skinned boy. He is quickly brought in, plonked in a dress, ready for the visit of Henry VIII. This boy continues to play act the role of Princess Elizabeth. This boy becomes Queen Elizabeth. Undeniably, this is a fantastic and fantastical tale, but it has many, if not more, of the problems that I talked about with Bakken's assertion about testicular feminisation. Elizabeth is always being watched. She is always in company. She is always being served. The notion that her male courtiers, her female courtiers and servants, the diplomats that were paying court to her on behalf of their kings and dukes and princes would not have noticed that this was a man in a dress are frankly absurd. We are centuries out from being able to block testosterone or offer gender reassignment surgery. That nobody would have noticed is unthinkable. that nobody would have mentioned that this queen isn't menstruating, or that this queen has an Adam's apple or a 5 o'clock shadow, is also impossible. Now, people have said, well, she wore heavy lead makeup. Yes, but she didn't put it on herself. Her maidservants would have done that. And if they were doing so to cover up a beard, I do think that somebody would have mentioned it. That is exactly the sort of explosive intelligence that would have been worth a fortune. However, before we put all of our physical, psychological and conspiratorial eggs in the one basket, we should maybe look for a more prosaic reason for Elizabeth not marrying. Who was on offer at this time? I think for many of her counsellors, they would have been keen to make a foreign match. A foreign prince or duke or king would have been a very useful ally for England. It would have strengthened its place in the world. But Elizabeth is a Protestant, and most of the crowned heads of Europe who had available males for her to marry were Catholic. One exception was King Eric of Sweden, who was a Protestant. However, from 1560, rumours abounded of his mental instability. So when it comes to foreign matches, her choices are people who are religiously opposed to her, Catholics, or a madman. Not potentially a very great dating pool, if we're honest. Of course, Elizabeth could have made a domestic match, and for a period of time there was a clear front-runner. Robert Dudley, her longtime friend, confidant and the master of her horse. However, at the start of her reign, Robert was already married. On the 8th of September 1560, Robert's wife Amy passed away. However, this did not clear the way unquestioningly for him to marry the Queen. As I point out in my video, The Original Staircase, which I'll link in a card up here, Amy died in suspicious circumstances and Robert was implicated. Any thought that the Queen of England might marry a man who had killed his wife so that he could marry her was simply too toxic to contemplate. It would have been political and dynastic suicide had Elizabeth taken on that path. Just because marriage to Robert Lord Dudley would have been career suicide for Elizabeth, it doesn't mean that she didn't love him. If he held her heart, it is possible that it made any other domestic or foreign match an anathema to her. It's also possible that she learnt well from the example of the two Marys in her life. Her sister, Mary Tudor, Mary I of England, and her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary I's marriage to the Catholic Philip of Spain was a cause of personal sorrow and political strife. Many of her subjects feared the foreign interference of this Spanish king, and they rose up against the match. Similarly, once married, her pregnancies that turned out to be mistaken pregnancies was a cause of personal sorrow, and also in some cases the mockery of her subjects. Mary had put her woman's body to the test, and it seemed it had failed her. Did Elizabeth learn from this and decide not to make the same mistakes? When Elizabeth looked north to the example of her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, it's perhaps easy to see that she would have been put off of making a domestic match of her own. Mary's second husband, Henry Lord Darnley, was a disaster. He was a violent, jealous drunk who, yes, gave her a son, but was also swiftly killed, perhaps on Mary's own orders. She then goes on to marry, perhaps under duress, the man suspected of killing that husband, James Lord Bothwell. In her third marriage, a domestic one, Mary sows the seeds for her own fall. She marries a subject and she loses the throne. Her sister's foreign match had been complicated and full of sorrow. Her cousin's domestic match had been disastrous. Is it any wonder that Elizabeth thought that following either path was too great a risk to take? She was intent to reign, to rule, and to hold her throne. And perhaps seeing these examples, she was shown that marriage was simply too great a risk for her to take. It is just possible that Queen Elizabeth was attempting to keep a different kind of secret. Not that she was the Bisley Boy, or that she was psychologically traumatised, or medically different. Perhaps The woman who rested so strongly on her status as a virgin queen was no virgin at all. Perhaps it happened under the roof of the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr. Her new husband, Thomas Seymour, his inappropriate flirtation may have turned into sexual abuse, with the young Elizabeth as its victim. It's also possible that she gave in to her strong affection and love for Robert Dudley and went to bed with him. There was certainly a rumour that a bastard child of Elizabeth had washed up on the coast of Europe. He was a man and he claimed that descent. Either way, if she was not a virgin, if she had had a bastard child, she would have been, I think, mortally afraid that a potential husband would have found it out on the wedding night, particularly if that husband was a foreign match. If one of the crowned heads of Europe had found out that Elizabeth was no virgin, and even worse, had had a bastard child, it would have been ruin. The Pope would have had a field day, and all of the Catholic states would have thought that everything they knew about her mother and her was true. It would have not just been shameful, it may have been politically disastrous. It may have been just the reason these people needed to invade England and take her throne from her. Maybe she didn't marry because she simply couldn't risk this being found out. Whatever her reasons for not marrying, by choosing not to, Elizabeth bucks the trend. Kings and queens marry because in doing so, they offer their dynasty and their country the chance of a legitimate heir of their bodies. With no heir, which Elizabeth is consigning herself and her nation to, there is the risk of massive unrest after the monarch's death. When you don't know what's coming next, it can be truly frightening for your people. So whatever is motivating this choice, I think it has to be a fairly big deal. I don't think it can just be a whim. But I'd love to know what you think. Why do you think Elizabeth didn't get married? Let me know in the comment section down below, or come and find me over on social media. I'll be leaving the links in the description box. You can follow me there and we can continue the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please also subscribe to my channel and click the bell icon so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.